Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Morphew, and I'm Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Education, and I want to welcome you to the fifth and final series in our webinars focused on the impossible or imperative safely reopening schools during a pandemic. Today, we're going to be venturing beyond some of the topics we've already covered in our first four webinars, and we're going to be talking about post-pandemic and post-reopening. We're going to be looking towards a post-COVID-19 future with a panel that we call, Can We Build a Marshall Plan for Education? For some background and context on the discussion we're going to have today, I'm going to ask you to take a minute here and we're going to look at some headlines that have been showing you and showing us the scope of education in the pandemic today. Again, welcome to our discussion on today. We're going to be talking about looking toward the future, can we build a Marshall Plan for education? In the four previous webinars that we've had on the subject of reopening schools during the pandemic, we've covered diverse topics. We've talked about the politics of education. We've talked about the impact the pandemic is having and will continue to have on educational inequities. We've talked about the importance of social-emotional learning and the social-emotional learning gap that we expect to occur as a result of the pandemic. And we've also talked about how the pandemic is changing education practice broadly. This week, we're going to put all that into perspective and we're going to think about the future. And as we consider the current crisis, we're going to look to the past, that is history, and to help us think about the future and the possibility of pushing forward towards a comprehensive national program and for recovery and reform in education. We've got a great set of panelists today, and let me go ahead and introduce them. First of all, Rick Hess is a resident scholar and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on K-12 and higher education issues. Rick is widely regarded as one of the nation's foremost experts on education. He's executive editor of Education Next, a regular contributor to Forbes and The Hill, and author of the Education Week blog, Rick Hess Straight Up. If he wasn't the author of that, we'd have some authorship issues, I would think. On that blog, Rick is famous for unveiling his annual rankings of the 200 university-based U.S. scholars with the biggest impact on educational practice and policy. Rick, we're delighted to have you here. Next up, we have Otis Johnson. Otis is a professor in sociology and education at Washington University in St. Louis, where he's also director of the National Science Foundation-funded Institute in Critical, Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies, and associate director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Among his many areas of research expertise, Otis is principal investigator of the Fatal Interactions with Police study, which has generated a national data file of police homicides. Otis, thank you for joining us today. And finally, Slavin. Bob Slavin is a professor here at the Johns Hopkins School of Education, where he's also director of the Center for Research and Reform in Education. He is co-founder of the Success for All Foundation, one of the nation's most successful whole school reform models. His research has focused on cooperative learning, desegregation, evidence-based reform, among other areas, and has led to the nation's largest research-based intervention to provide school-based vision care. I also have the pleasure of sharing with you, the audience, that Bob was recently named our School of Education's inaugural School of Education Distinguished Professor. Bob, thank you so much for being here. And to our audience, thank you for being here. Let me start with a few guidelines about our discussion. I'm going to start today's session by asking each of the panelists one question that will get things rolling, and then I'll be directing a series of prepared and reactive questions to the entire group. But you're here for a reason. We want you to join in. You can submit questions using that handy Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can even upvote questions. I'm told, I've never done this before, but I'm told you can upvote questions in the chat, in that Q&A chat, by clicking on upvote. And we will do our best to get to as many audience questions as possible, and certainly we'll try to get to the questions that have the upvotes of members of the audience as well. So welcome. We've got a very interesting hour in front of us. Let's go ahead and get started. Bob Slavin, let me start with you. In my introduction, Bob, I mentioned your national and international status in education reform, evidence-based practice, and you were the originator of this idea of a Marshall Plan for education. Back in April, when the long-term impacts of this pandemic were barely on the horizon, you wrote a blog post that caught attention of many of us, including me, and you called for a Marshall Plan for education. Can you tell us why did that metaphor resonate with you, and what do you see as the core idea behind such a plan?
Well, thank you. Very glad to be here. Basically, the Marshall Plan, I think, as most people know, came at the end of World War II, when Europe and Japan were utterly destroyed. The damage to their infrastructure, to their people, to everything was quite severe. And the US had the idea that they needed to invest in the rebuilding of Western Europe. Actually, they offered to include Eastern Europe as well, but the Soviets said no thanks. So they provided really quite massive money to help these societies get back on an even keel. And in these very devastated places, there were very rapid rebuilding that took place as a result of that. And the US itself profited quite substantially from its trading partners and from grateful nations that formed a Western Union around the common set of values and trading partners. Now, in the case of education, we face another major disaster. It's not so physically obvious, but the impact is just horrifying for many, many children, and particularly children who are disadvantaged or who are in remote rural places and otherwise who have really had no schooling since last spring. And certainly as students are beginning to come back to school, I think we're seeing the enormous job that's there for us to do. My proposal was to have the federal government invest particularly in tutoring for children who are having great difficulties. My colleagues and I just completed reviews of research on what are the most effective things for struggling students in reading and also in mathematics. And the number one thing by far that makes a big difference is tutoring. And where tutoring was once thought of as something very expensive and difficult to do, there have now been many tutoring programs that are much more cost effective and much more able to work at a reasonable amount of money. My proposal for a Marshall Plan was to put quite substantial investment into hiring tutors. My estimate is about 150,000 of them would be a good start. People who have college degrees, but not necessarily teaching certificates. These people all over the country would work locally and would be trained in proven tutoring models. Not all tutoring models work, so it'd be most important to have tutors who are working 1-to-1, 1-to-4, 1-to-2, different ratios depending on need, but would be working using specific, well-designed, well-trained programs with children at different grade levels, with the intent being to try to make rapid progress in reading and mathematics, so that students would be able to continue then their education, having those, real strong background in those basic skills. The idea, of course, is mostly focused on the students who would benefit, but at the same time, there are millions of people who are unemployed, and particularly new graduates from colleges and universities. And part of the idea here too is that at the same time as you're benefiting the many children who would need those services, we estimate if you had 150,000 tutors that they might be able to work with maybe 7 million children, that you would benefit the economy by having those people be able to support themselves and to contribute to the economy. And the very best of them might then later become teachers, might become classroom teachers in their areas. So the notion would be, as in the original Marshall Plan, to have a heavy investment, but for a short period of time, to get things more back to an even keel and have students who are able to make the kind of progress that really all students have a right to expect.
So Rick, let me follow up with you. In my introduction, I cited your highly visible role as an education scholar and analyst and commentator. Bob, I think, is suggesting that we might be at a moment in time that's unusual, maybe even historic, akin to what we saw in post-World War II. In your role as an education policy maven, you've probably witnessed plenty of moments where we as a nation seem to be on the cusp of some opportunistic or change in education, only to fizzle out. Is there anything different here about the moment we're in and about the possibility for a broad impact, systemic impact on education?
So it's a fantastic question. And, partly it depends how you define it on both ends. Partly what lens you look at the challenge and the opportunity through, and what solution attached to it. I think two of the things I really like about what Bob just sketched. One, I think the Marshall Plan is just a really engaging metaphor. I'm not sure it's the right metaphor, but that doesn't actually matter. There's lots of good metaphors, and I love that he put it out there that way. And then I think the tutoring piece is just a compelling piece of any response. So look, let me talk about both kind of the diagnosis and then how I think a bit about the solution as a way of answering, Chris, kind of whether this is different. Look, if we think about the situation Bob described at the end of World War II, you had whole national economies that were flattened. The buildings were leveled, houses, factories. So when the US was investing in the Belgiums and the Frances and the West Germanys, what we were doing was really standing up stuff. We were building new buildings, we were helping enterprises get back off the ground, and we were doing that within an infrastructure of law and property rights and the rest, so that when we sprinkled this money on the ground, it got up and running. To me, that actually feels a little more analogous to what we saw in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, when what you had was natural disaster flattened a school system, and the question for both federal investors and philanthropists was, how do we stand this thing back up? What's a little different, I think, as we think about the challenge right now, is it's not as if American system of schooling has been flattened. Basically, it's been put in mothballs in big chunks of the country. And Bob's 100% right about the huge consequences of this for children. I'm not disagreeing at all about the consequences, but I think we ought to understand kind of the nature of the challenge. And the fact that all of these schools are up there standing, and then in places like Northern Virginia and New Jersey, we've still got buses driving their routes empty with no kids because of contracts, and that we've still got people on payroll across the land, means we're not talking about standing up a new system. What we're talking about is when kids walk back into the schools that they're used to. That's significant because it means that all of the things that can get in the way are still going to be there when kids walk back to school or as kids are learning online. So Los Angeles is missing 6,000 supposed to be kindergartners. There are huge problems, I think, with 80% of these families are low income. A lot of them don't speak English, over half. So I think there's huge problems with these children just getting online. We have Seattle, half the kids haven't logged into the school system yet. In the spring, even at the end of the spring, only about 1/3 of districts were regularly delivering any kind of real-time instruction. So we've got school districts and school systems that have real challenges because of operating procedures, because of contracts, all of that stuff's still there. So the problem with the Marshall Plan analogy by itself, I think, is that when we think about investing into this, what we really need, what I hear Bob talking about, and I agree, is we need to think about how do we not only leapfrog the quality of education that we're giving to all of our children, but how do we do that for kids who have lost a lot of education over the last 6 months and counting. I think that requires Bob's kind of tutoring as a starting point, but I don't think it's enough. I think we need to think more aggressively because I think we need more than a Marshall Plan is needed. What we really need to do, I think, is take a hard look at all of the reasons that kids have not always been well served. And we're having, I think, a national conversation about some of that as it relates to issues of race and discipline. But I think there's a lot more to it. And I think we also need to think about what are the things that get in the way of making that happen. Kind of a series of deregulatory questions. How do we better use technology? How do we deliver instruction more effectively? How do we get it to families where they need it and when they need it? And so that goes to the second part. So I think the problem with the Marshall Plan is it kind of presumes we just need to build and then we've got an infrastructure that when we build things will work. I don't think we have that. I think we need more in the way of deregulatory and systemic change to really make things play out differently. And what that means is I love Bob's tutoring suggestion. Kurt Van Lane's work had me convinced on this already even before. But I think, when people like Slavin are kind of taking a careful look at it, you come out convinced. And I think there's a lot of fantastic artificial intelligence tutoring too, that we've learned that particularly for discrete skills at particular grade levels in terms of mastery of things like, phonemic awareness and certain math functions, AI can be an incredibly cheap and powerful way to help kids rapidly catch up. So I think both AI and in-person and human tutoring together can have a huge impact. But when we think about what it would look like to think about the transformative opportunity that we're wrestling with, we see lots of families, 25, 30% of families say they're really frustrated by schools. They're not even sure they want to send their kids back to public schools because what they have seen is disappointing them. They don't think their children are getting well served. Okay, I think that opens a huge conversation about the things raised by pandemic pods, about how do you get high quality sustained online delivery, about whether children 14 to 18 don't really need to be in a building for 7 hours because there's actual things that are engaging them that we can do. I think a lot of questions get raised that we need to wrestle with. And so, Chris, to go back to your starting question, how is it similar? How is it different? I think we have never in my life seen anything nearly as disruptive as what we're living through in American education. This has thrown families completely off center. We see some families thankful for any school that finds a way to safely open. We see them appreciative of teachers online. We see huge conversations about how this is playing out for different kids in different communities. This is different from any of our previous kind of challenges or crises. But I think what we need to do, therefore, is realize that some of the ways we've tried to solve this before, No Child Left Behind, or improving teacher evaluation, or promoting the Common Core, or Race to the Top, or School Improvement Grant Program, these were all much more targeted efforts designed to help some schools or impose accountability. And I think really seizing this opportunity requires us to ask, what are the things that are really frustrating families? And they're very different in different cities and different states and different family circumstances. And taking Bob's tutoring point as a crucial plank in it, but what's a more fully articulated set of strategies that's going to give all of these kids and all these families what they need. And so I think Bob has really kicked us off into a terrific inquiry. but I think that's only kind of the first couple steps down that path.
Thanks, Rick. Otis, it's your turn here. In my introduction, I talked about your expertise in social inequality, youth development, particularly in African-American populations. You know, every webinar that we've had, this is our fifth in this series, the topic of inequity has come up very quickly, oftentimes with brutal clarity. Access to technology, food security, transportation, wellness. You heard some of that in Rick's answer as well. The questions that have risen up around how different children are being served by schools. The pandemic is increasing the burden on populations that are already poor and underrepresented. As we think about taking some big, bold steps here to reform education and using the pandemic as a jumping off point, what do you see as critical priorities?
Thanks, Chris. And yes, I agree with all that's been said. I have been thinking about, I guess, what comes first and how we might proceed. I do believe that reforms to the social safety net are essential, and racial reform, and I can talk a little bit about that more. And then we can move into educational reform. And I think the pandemic and the fact that schools had to respond so quickly and so immediately left bare a lot of inequalities that you've just mentioned. Food insecurity, I would add housing insecurity, wellness, definitely transportation and issues of access. And so as an executive on the board of education of a large school system within Missouri, we were forced with a lot of hard decisions. We had to ask, how do we support special education, which not only included access to healthcare professionals, but also structured learning environments that could control potential distractions. We struggled with how to support our emerging multilingual populations that needed consistent individual resources to sustain the development of a language that perhaps was not the primary language in their home. How could we detect the onset of behavioral and health conditions that are often discovered by teachers as they interact with children in the classroom? And we were also struck with food insecurity, as you mentioned, and how do we deliver food, have access to our food programs, given that about half of our nation's population no longer attends neighborhood schools. So many students either had to take public transportation or their parents had to drive in order for them to access food. And then also to understand that food insecurity is really an issue faced by entire families, not just the students. So our question was, who are we really feeding in this situation? And oftentimes, how can we make sure that our students are getting nutrition? And so it was just a host of other problems, including how do we assist larger families in creating an appropriate instructional environment for all their children? And knowing that some families, in fact, were suffering from housing insecurity to begin with. So a lot of these questions came up, and it laid bare a lot of the challenges families incur even when schools are open. And I agree with Rick in the fact that many of the inequalities and inequities that impinge on learning and have done so before COVID would continue after the pandemic subsides if we didn't take this opportunity, as Bob is saying, to really fundamentally reimagine education, public education. There's one thing that I want to mention about racial reform. And the reason why I think that this is really important here is because we immediately put out a survey between April 27th and the second week in May in 2020 to understand how the nation was responding to the COVID pandemic. It was a national survey, nationally representative data file, and we had about 1,100 parents that responded. And there were huge inequalities according to race and income. 49% of low and moderate income households reported that their children spent less than 10 hours per week on school-sponsored activities compared to only 37% of middle and high income households. Twice the amount of low income and moderate income households reported having inadequate space for learning at home when compared to middle and high income households. There were racial disparities as well. About 15% of Black parents reported that their children attended a school without a distance learning program. And 72% of those parents reported, Black parents reported that their child's school did not offer, only 72% said that their child's school offered the necessary distance learning tools. So we understand then that a lot of the factors, the same social determinants, the same comorbidities related to the disproportionate infection, hospitalization, and death experienced by people of color in the pandemic are the same factors that are related to achievement inequality and differences in educational opportunity. And that would include food insecurity, housing insecurity, and other resources that are needed, like access to technology, transportation, and so forth. So how do we move forward? I would definitely say that there couldn't be a Marshall Plan. It's at least hard to imagine a Marshall Plan for schools that would not take into consideration the structural and systemic racism that, again, are part of the same factors related to actual COVID death rates and hospitalization rates, but also the other institutions that are supposed to serve all populations, irrespective of their social background and race, and that includes educational institutions. So until we restore or address all of those insecurities that we mentioned at first, and then move to an understanding of how our systems have woefully underprepared and undersupported Black families, Latinx families, and Indigenous families, then whatever changes we make to education going forward will really matter at very little, if at all. So that's why I think we should be talking about social reform, racial reform, and then moving to strengthen our schools. Because the truth is, our schools need saving as much as our children. So whatever we give to schools to give to kids, there's going to be some hard calculation within those institutions about what bill do we pay first? Do we pay for the tutors that Bob is suggesting would be wonderful, and I agree with the strategy? Or do we pay the school because it hasn't been supported and its basic functions have been undermined by decades of neglect? So I think that is really the challenge before us.
Thanks, Otis. Rick, let me go to you. Otis's discussion of this and his focus on the need for reform beyond education with a emphasis on equity. Historically, that has been the federal government's role, and equity focus in some of these areas. And the Marshall Plan analogy also suggests the need for significant federal investment to make some of these changes. So is this, do you see this as a case where we could pursue some of these changes that in education and social reform that Otis is talking about with relatively little investment on the part of states, or is this something where the federal government can and should be very active?
So, I mean, I think, again, it comes back to what problem we're trying to solve. Otis and I think, would disagree significantly on how we understand both the nature of the challenges and what remedies are appropriate, which means we're going to disagree certainly about what state and federal role ought to entail. Look, partly it depends on, on one starting place. We spend about $14,000 a kid across the U.S. A place like New York City is spending $28,000, $29,000 a year. When a district is spending $28,000 a year, that's on a classroom of 20 children, that's $560,000, $570,000. Somebody like me does not deny that money matters, but I am reluctant to have anybody pony up more money until I'm confident that existing funds are being well spent, whether it's the feds or the state. And I have been too often unconvinced in the course of my career working with school districts that they are being as careful and as thoughtful about investing these dollars to help kids as needs to be. So that's the starting point. And I think that's probably generally reflective of the right. We tend to be more skeptical. And I think our friends on the left tend to be more sympathetic to the challenges that districts are wrestling with. If that's the case, if convinced that more money is going to be spent effectively, and again, this is kind of where the Marshall Plan analogy is so useful, that in New Orleans, there was a sense among a lot of folks on the right that we weren't just putting dollars into existing pension and healthcare agreements for current employees, but that new funds were starting new schools, were actually transporting children, were actually making a difference for kids who needed aid. Then I think it's much easier to imagine bipartisan agreement on spending those funds. When there's a sense that these funds are going into unaddressed problems with retirements, with overly costly employee healthcare plans, into districts that are hamstrung by vendor and contractual agreements and policy that make it hard to serve children well, certainly not comfortable with federal funds. I'm not even crazy about state funds. And to the extent that I am comfortable with federal funds, I think, the way Bob framed it, that this is not an ongoing, unchanging investment. This is a burst. This is an effort to rebuild something. And I think that's part of, when I read the history of how George C. Marshall sold kind of the Truman White House on this, part of it was we're not going to be spending these dollars 30 years downstream. These are dollars we'll spend now, and downstream, there will be huge benefits. I think there's a sense that the way this often gets talked about in Washington is once dollars are allocated, they're going to be allocated forever. So a big challenge would be, how do you think about this investment in a way that really fits Bob's model? This is a burst. This is a 5-year plan. At the end of 5 years, things are going to look fundamentally different. I think there's a sense that that means high leverage investments, which are going to be things like building data capability, fundamentally transformative research. To Otis's point, changing structures or systems that are getting in the way of serving all of our children and opening the doors of opportunity for every child. And that if you can tell a story like that, I think you might be able to find some support for federal investment. I think more than that, I think even that is going to be incredibly challenging. I think more than that is unlikely to go anywhere unless Democrats, just really run up the scoreboard in November, in which case, who knows?
So thanks, Rick. Bob, that's a nice segue to a question I wanted to ask you about the November election. I don't know if you know this or not, but in November, there's a big election coming up in just a few weeks. You may have heard about this. How do you think the November election results are likely to affect the chances of systemic change occurring in K-12 and the education reform that I know you've been working decades on?
Well, my belief is that what we've seen in the last 4 years at best has been stasis. I mean, has been no progress. At worst, it's been catastrophic for education and for social development in many different ways. It didn't have to be. It is, the Republican Party has a proud tradition of being able to respond to crises and to deal with crises in an appropriate way. And this particular administration, I think it would be very hard unless you're, I think, more of a partisan than I think Rick is, to say that response has been competent or appropriate. The Democrats, I think, in the previous administration, were moving towards something I think very important, very positive, that I hope will be able to serve as a basis for the response to the world in post-COVID. What they were starting to move toward was an emphasis on evidence-based reform, on using things that are proven to work. And I have to say that was very much a bipartisan movement. The ESSA plan had a lot of discussion of evidence-based reform, and that was as much supported by Republicans as by Democrats. I think that we need to have a movement that is taking into account what we know is effective in education, what we know is needed, and with a heavy focus on remedying some of the problems that Otis is talking about. The structural racism that's built into our schooling system, I think, is hard to deny. We are somehow able to be at peace with the most terrible circumstances that have existed long before COVID, and we have an opportunity to try to make a difference with that. So if the Democrats are able to get back the White House and the Senate, I'm expecting very creative plans that may go into effect to try to make a longer term difference. I'd never pretend that my Marshall Plan notion is anything more than a starting point, but we need to build from that using evidence, using what we know is effective, looking in particular at situations in which outcomes are particularly disturbing and in which there's need for food security and physical security and many other things, along with the education goal. But we need to regain a belief in progress and a belief and hold ourselves accountable. I think that's where I absolutely agree with Rick. We don't want to just throw money at this situation. We want a sense of investment in things that we know to work, the things that are proven to make a difference, so that taxpayers can be confident that the money that they're being asked to contribute is being used well. I work quite a bit in England, where the conservative government is promoting something very much like the plan that I'm talking about here. They've put £1 billion into schools, mostly to pay for tutoring, to help schools recover from their effects of COVID that they're experiencing there, very much like ours. This is not a left-right thing. This is really a question of taking appropriate actions, using things that are proven to work, watching how they develop and evaluating them over time so that you're sure that they're making the difference that you're paying for.
So Otis, Rick intimated in his follow-up answer to what you'd been talking about that the two of you might not agree on everything. But I did see you nodding your head a bit when you were listening to him, particularly when he was talking about that this is maybe more of a need for reform and accountability than it is for necessarily spending more money. But let me give you a chance to weigh in on the politics of this. What do you think needs to happen in order, from a political point of view and a policy point of view, to make some of this happen?
Well, I don't presume that there are big differences between Rick and I. I do think, however, there are a few things. One, he mentioned how resources are currently constituted and used. And I agree that clearly there are ways in which systems can be reformed in order to make better use of public resources. So I have no problems with that. But there are other things that I think are resources that aren't always about the bottom dollar, the bottom line here. And we all know that the early childhood longitudinal study looked at a lot of school resources, 14 of them in fact, and found that African Americans were lower on average on all 14 than other populations. And one of them was exposure to teachers with high expectations. Now that's a key resource. And I'm not saying that that can be fixed with dollars, but it is something that is a resource and something that needs to be fixed within schools. A belief that all African American children can learn, that's not universally held by our teachers right now. And so a resource would be getting teachers in positions to actually make big changes in kids' lives. Within my own system, we're struggling to get teachers that have mathematics backgrounds. So there's a national teacher shortage that is impacting us more so than it would predominantly white and suburban schools. So there is a structural racial difference in resources that can't just be explained by dollars. And it's that type of inequality and inequity that I think should be of great concern to all of us, including Rick, even those on the right like him. So that was why I was shaking my head. Yes, definitely we should be concerned with how the resources are spent, but also there are inequalities in resources that often aren't, I guess, bound or explained by money that are hugely important to getting rid of these achievement inequalities.
So I'm going to get to audience members' questions in just a second, but let me ask Rick one more question here, and that is, as I listened to, as I read Bob's blog and listened to his description of the Marshall Plan, read up a little bit on myself, reminded myself what I'd learned a long time ago. The Marshall Plan was, and you mentioned this too, it wasn't just about buildings. It was about, to some degree, it was about building democracy in these countries that had been just been violently changed, right? And part of what I hear in Otis's response and his talking about access to resources and giving students access, for example, to teachers with high expectations, that's about, to some degree, about citizenship and about providing people with access to democracy. So how much of this do you think is, how much of you think if this is about sort of that building of a democracy? And is that something maybe that a bipartisan effort could get behind, the idea of building the democratic skills and in students that we need?
Yeah, yeah, I do. And I think, it's interesting when you look at the polling on the American response to COVID and schools and COVID. I mean, there's two things going on. One, there's a lot of people who are really frustrated. Schools aren't opening, schools are, here they are essential workers and they're told, figure out what to do with your 8-year-old. You've got to show up and go be a sanitation worker or work in a grocery store, but we don't know what to do with your 8-year-old, figure it out. And then at the same time, you also see 60, 70% of Americans say, we're so appreciative of our teachers. This is so hard, we see, and both of these things are going on at once. And I think part of the possibility in responding to COVID is that both of these impulses make sense and we could see them working together. The systems that we have now, as Otis is saying, don't work for lots of families. And I wouldn't say it's just about race or income. I think there's lots of, affluent, educated two-earner families who are like, oh my God, this is a disaster. And I thought I lived in a good. So I think this is a hugely unifying opportunity. Suddenly these folks they had figured it out are as frustrated as people who were locked into bad schools. But I think there's two things in terms of translating that unifying vision to what you're talking about, Chris. One is, Otis, maybe we don't disagree that much. What you were just saying, absolutely. We know that there are too many children who were born, into certain households, and they have teachers who don't ask enough of them. I'm with you. And about the difficulty of recruiting teachers. And part of my frustration is right now is I'm caught in these DC conversations where people who've been very inspired by Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo are saying that the very notion of expectations is racist. And for me, that's a very difficult conversation to have because I'm like, look, if you're telling me that it's racist to think the Black and Latino children can learn, I'm not sure how we find common ground, period. So one, I think partly we're caught in these cultural, very passionate, very intense cultural conversations right now, which make it harder sometimes to find this common thread, Chris, that we're talking about. And we might actually mean the same thing, but we're talking about it in such different language in such different ways that maybe we're talking past each other. And I think the second thing that goes, and this is where Bob really launched us, is if this is the challenge, we need every child to have adults who set high expectations for them. And too many children are in single parent households, and too many children don't get these supports and resources in their community or school. Well, this is part of the opportunity to reimagine education. I mean, when we think about what we can provide today, is Bob's right, there's millions of educated adults who are out of work who would love, and we don't just need them to be reading and math tutors. We no longer have the YMCA and the Big Brother programs across the country that we had 40 or 50 years ago. We need to figure out how communities can stand up more of that infrastructure, more of those networks for kids and families that are struggling. We need to think about how do we use technology to help parents tap into what's really happening for their kid, how to connect psychiatrists and counselors. How do we bring those resources into homes, even when schools reopen, for parents who have trouble? How do we use this new tech to let parents have daily check-ins with teachers if that's what it takes, instead of having to figure a way to ride 2 buses to school once a quarter for an obligatory kind of sit down? Like, these are structural impediments that absolutely, to Otis's point, play out much more severely in some communities than others. And this is, I think, to Bob's larger point, the kind of larger rethinking that we need, and this could be an opportunity for it. And one of my great frustrations is I worry that we are so polarized and so distrustful that we might just let this opportunity slip through our fingers because we're unable to sit down and figure out that we're actually on the same page on a significant chunk of stuff.
So Bob, let me move to you next, and listening to Rick's response there and thinking about what would constitute real reform, what can sort of be sold as democracy building reform and potentially innovative reform. We've got a couple questions from the audience asking about your tutors, right? Who would train these tutors so that they reflect the best practices? What about using retired educators and others with a college degree for tutors? Without getting too deep into the weeds here, how does the tutoring plan tick some of these boxes that we've been hearing about in addressing inequities, on building democratic practices, bipartisan, innovative for reform? Talk about that a little bit, if you could.
Well, a lot of the issues that we're talking about here are issues that existed before COVID and will exist for quite a long time. These are, they're not in, that's not to say that they're not extremely important, but we do have a very timely problem here. Yes, we need to worry about the democratic participation and skills and knowledge about our system of our children. But at the moment, they're hungry. At the moment, many of them are not healthy for reasons that don't have to do directly with COVID, but indirectly. Many of them are far behind in reading and in mathematics. And to expect to have a genuinely democratic, peaceful, progressive nation with many, many children who are not good at reading and not good at math is expecting something that has never existed and will never exist. Thomas Jefferson said, if I have to choose between democracy and newspapers, I'll take the newspapers. That's only works if people can read the newspapers. Democratic participation flows from an ability to participate in the society as a full member, and that requires a level of success in education that we weren't producing adequately for many kids before COVID, and those same kids who were at risk before are now in terrible trouble. I think all I'm really arguing for is we need to, in the near term, we need to solve the heck out of those problems. And my hope is, I should say, that if we could demonstrate that we could make a major difference in many, many, many children using something powerful and proven like tutoring, that would be a demonstration that we don't have to accept the situation that existed before COVID. That whenever you have a child for any reason who is not succeeding, that child can succeed. And that's an important piece of information that I think many people in our society and our political culture really don't believe.
Thanks, Bob. That's compelling. I like that. Otis, we've got a couple questions from the audience around, and this relates to what Bob was just talking about in terms of what's going to be required for democracy. You mentioned a study that where you just collected data on attitudes and expectations around education from parents, I believe. And the question, we got a couple questions about special students with special needs, special education students, students with disabilities. Did your study collect any data around those? And what does it mean? What does it mean for those students in this pandemic in terms of getting the resources they need? And as Bob said, they weren't getting the resources and services they needed before the pandemic. What's likely to happen with them post-pandemic?
Our first wave of data did not collect information on particular segments of the student population. So we were focused mainly on how families are faring. So most of our questions are really general when it came to education, like are you in a distance learning plan currently? But wave 2 is collecting that data. So we'll have more to say on that probably in the latter half of 2022. I did want Chris to make a comment about the conversation that just happened, especially Bob's point, and also getting back to Rick's point. Not only are we talking about those soft resources, but I want to suggest that we shouldn't be thinking as much about how much that pie increases or that bottom line figure increases, but also how that pie is distributed. It's clear that there are some gross inequalities across districts and systems and across populations that we're going to have to address. But I think one potential solution, and I see this as a more fundamental point, is to think about or reimagine how we move forward as democratic society. Right now, I'm in St. Louis, one of the most politically and racially fragmented metropolitan areas in the nation. And here people actually pay a premium to be racially segregated. And they will pay their local taxes to support public education, but then pay extra for the private school for their own kids to attend. In essence, paying for 2 educations because they don't believe that one education that is good for a child of color could possibly be good for their own. And it's that type of acceptance, that type of racial dynamic, that structural racism that allows this pie to be distributed in inequitable ways. Again, to Rick's point, we're not always talking about increasing resources. I'm talking about the structure of racial opportunity and the fact that the way resources are currently allocated across systems and for kids, that African-American, Indigenous, and Latinx kids come up short. And until we get to a recognition of those fundamentals, the fact that segregation is costly, it is negatively related to cities' GDP, but yet we have those who are in power that are willing to incur the costs just for their separateness. Until we get to that type of racial reasoning and move toward racial reform, we're not going to solve the problem. Instead, we will have to have Bob's solution of hiring tutors, when if we would get to more fundamental issues, we wouldn't need tutors in the first place.
Thanks, Otis. We're almost at time, and I want to end by giving each of the panelists an opportunity for a very quick, because we're at 1:55 p.m. here, a very quick last word. So Rick, let me start with you. What do you see, and I'll ask all the panelists to respond to the same question here, which is, what do you see as the lasting consequences for the pandemic? with respect to productively reshaping and reforming our nation's education system?
I think we're on a precipice. And I think the longer this goes on, the closer we get to the edge of it. I think, as I've mentioned, that when you especially look at the polling, there's a significant number of Americans who say they're considering homeschooling in the future, who express grave concerns about what they see happening to their kids. They're concerned that their kids who were previously kind of content to assume schools know what they're doing. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of Americans who are just grateful when schools are able to figure out ways to get open. Schools play a huge role in children's lives, in families' lives, up and beyond, literacy and numeracy. And I think there's parents are willing to cut schools a lot of slack right now if schools are opening safely and responsibly. And I think the longer this goes on, the sharper that's going to get. And what you're seeing is, on the one hand, people who are saying, look, I'm not as concerned about how much my kids are learning as I am about the school's running and letting them have normal lives. And on the other hand, people who are saying, I'm looking for pandemic pods, I'm embracing private schools, which seem to make more of a priority of actually opening their doors. And I think what that does is it creates an opportunity to say, wait a minute, what problem, the problem that Benjamin Rush and Horace Mann and John Dewey set out to solve, maybe our public school system actually isn't doing a very good job solving any of that. And I think that starts to open a whole bunch of conversations that can go any number of ways about what it looks like going forward.
Otis, what about you? Lasting consequences for the pandemic with regard to some of the issues we've been talking about?
Lasting consequences. I would say that, I guess, primary among them is getting schools reopened and committed to fixing some of the issues that have made schools so inequitable right now, or learning so inequitable. We need to move toward resilient schools. And I would say that these schools, a resilient school, would be prepared for a pandemic and to make effective remedies for what was unexpected and what ended up falling in everyone's lap, to the point where families aren't suffering as much as they currently are. And I think that is what we should strive for, that we get those social resources in place, that we all commit to a type of racial democracy and racial justice, and then we strive for resilient educational institutions that can actually respond to crises instead of folding, as many have in this current pandemic.
And Bob, you kicked this all off with your original blog post on the idea of a Marshall Plan and tutoring. What are your thoughts here about lasting consequences?
Well, I can tell you my immediate terror, which is that kids, when they finally go back to school, the teacher will say, well, welcome back, kids. I'm so glad to see you. Now let's open up to page 327 when we left off last March. And my fear is that that's precisely what is going to happen unless we take very resolute and action to say, no, that is simply not, it wasn't acceptable last March, but it's absolutely not acceptable today. We need to be able to respond to the needs of kids, whatever those needs may be, at a level that that is commensurate with the problems that those kids are facing. I hope that a successful set of interventions, a successful set of solutions, will have an additional, a knock-on effect, as they say in England, to make people feel as though the problems of education really are solvable. That what we have in hand, if we have the will, that we've got the capacity, we've got the programs, we've got the knowledge to make a substantial difference in schools. And I hope that the COVID experience will enable us to learn that, to learn how much difference we really can make with kids by using things that are proven to work, by using intelligent uses of funding, and then making absolutely sure that all students genuinely are succeeding at the highest levels. I think this is absolutely possible, and that we may have had to have a shock to get into thinking this way. But and I hope that that's the way this goes, because if it just says, well, you know, okay, they're back in school, problem solved, no more problem, we're in very big trouble.
Well, thank you. Thanks to our audience for hanging with us today. It's 2:01, so let me finish up here and thank all of our panelists for what I thought was a really thoughtful and provocative discussion on an incredibly important topic, what our schools are going to be doing and what they're going to look like post-pandemic, which I think we're all very concerned about. I want to thank the School of Education team that has been operating behind the scenes for all 5 of these webinars. We've got IT professionals, communications professionals, Ed Yarborough, Amira Gardner, John Grant, John Robertson, Mary Beth Regan, Jim Sheehan, Regis Bondroll, Annette Anderson, who's our producer, and Ashley Curitan. They've been doing all the hard work here, making these things happen. We've had a great session of today, capping off our 5 webinars that we've run on the impossible or imperative reopening of our nation's schools. If you want to catch up any of the episodes you might have missed, please visit education.jhu.edu/impossible or imperative. We've got highlights there. We've got recordings there. Thank you for spending an hour with us today. My name's Chris Morphew. I'm Dean of the School of Education at Johns Hopkins. Have a great rest of your day.